afternoon. Thank you all for attending. This is a packed house. I am a little surprised we got so many, but actually I'm not surprised because the topic of today's discussion is really urgent and necessary, so thank you all for being here. My name is Melissa Murray. I'm a member of the ACS Executive Board as well as a professor of law at New York University School of Law, where I am also the faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. When we began planning this year's convention, we had a lot of discussion about what kinds of topics we wanted to cover, and obviously one of the things we wanted to cover were the continuing assaults on women's reproductive rights. But importantly, we also wanted to emphasize that though the threat to reproductive rights is urgent, it is not the only threat facing women's rights. So this panel is one that takes the question of reproductive rights off the table to focus on other issues. That doesn't mean we can't think about how these issues relate to the question of reproductive rights, as they are all inextricably linked, but that we wanted to focus on other aspects of women's equal citizenship that are implicated by all of the issues and things that we're seeing going on in our discourse right now. And to get us going, we have a really distinguished panel. So I will first introduce them. They're not in order on the panel, but I will ask them to indicate themselves by raising their hands briefly as we go in the order that they will speak. Our first panelist is Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, who's a Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, and the founding director of Irvine's Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. Her work considers a wide range of topics, including market commodifications of organs and gametes and the criminalization of reproduction. Following Professor Goodwin is Deborah Katz. Deborah. Deborah is a founding partner of Katz, Marshall & Banks, LLP, where she concentrates her practice on employment discrimination, sexual harassment, wrongful discharge, Sarbanes-Oxley, corporate, environmental, and other whistleblower retaliation claims, SEC whistleblower tips, and contractual employment disputes. More recently, a good deal of her practice has focused on the expanding range of Me Too-influenced sexual harassment claims. Directly to my left is Dina Baxt, the co-founder and co-president of A Better Balance, a leading national legal advocacy organization headquartered in New York City, which is dedicated to advancing the rights of working families, promoting fairness in the workplace, and helping workers across the economic spectrum care for themselves and their families without risking their economic security. The lady in red in the center of the panel is NYU alumna Carole Robles-Roman, who is the general counsel and dean of faculty at Hunter College. Prior to her appointment at Hunter, Carole served as the co-president and CEO of the ERA Coalition Fund for Women's Equality and as New York City's deputy mayor for legal affairs and counsel to Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Finally, at the very end of the panel is Inez Feltscher-Stetman. Inez is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. She has worked in education policy for 7 years, and prior to joining the IWF, was the Director of Education and Workforce Development at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Her research focuses on educational freedom, school choice, and the cultural impact of empowering parents with control over their children's educations. So the format of today's discussion will go as follows. Each speaker will spend about 5 minutes articulating a position or identifying a particular issue for us to think about. After each panelist has spoken, we'll have a moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So please keep your questions in mind as we talk, and we will raise those toward the end. So let's start with Professor Goodwin.
Okay, thank you so much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And so I want to start with thinking about not just reproduction in terms of what we've been sort of hearing about, thinking about Alabama, Georgia, all of the horrors, although that's part of where I want to flash. You know, as we all know, a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than she is actually by terminating her pregnancy. And abortion is as safe as a penicillin shot, according to the World Health Organization. So if you think about that, I think it's important to think about what's the constitutional status of a woman if we say, in fact, we deny something that actually will be incredibly safe for you and force you into a possibility of something that could actually kill you. And given that the United States ranks at about 50th in the world in terms of keeping women safe during pregnancy, then we know that it's a foregone conclusion, the risks for women with carrying pregnancies to term. But I want to flash slash the criminalization and the civil punishments because it's not just about reproductive health access and abortion. And I think in some ways, as we think about reproductive rights, we've lost a sense of what the bundle of rights should be as we focus just within one space. And for those of you who've been following issues such as maternal mortality, and particularly what that looks like racialized, you know entirely what I mean. But when we think about the criminalization aspects, it's not just a new phenomenon why we're here, but over the last 30 years or so, there have been the efforts to criminalize women in the reproductive space. There have been states like Alabama. Just within the last few years in Alabama, there have been over 500 women who've taken plea deals under their fetal endangerment law. And these plea deals include 20-year sentences where they're threatened, you don't really want this to go before a jury, do you? And women taking 10, 20-year plea deals. And what are we talking about? You know, the Alabama fetal endangerment law was actually intended to crack down on people, mostly men, who were turning their homes into meth labs so that the meth labs wouldn't explode and wouldn't harm children inside. But instead, what prosecutors found very easy to do is to co-opt doctors and to get doctors to serve as basically deputized law enforcement, quasi-law enforcement, and actually squeal, you know, snitch on their women patients who were coming in or who had confessed or just simply told their doctors that they had used meth during their pregnancies. But it's not just within those spaces, right? We have women who've been arrested for falling downstairs during pregnancy. In Iowa, women threatened with arrest for refusing C-section in our country. This criminalized space is now normalized because it fell on the backs of Black women and Latina women in the 1980s and the 1990s. The crack mama crackdown, you know, and we all know today that, in fact, the sort of crack baby terminology, what was behind it was all a myth. But it served as a platform for criminalization and also civil punishment. And I think it'd be worth everybody in this audience taking a look at what the New York Times published during the 1980s and 90s, Wall Street Journal. I mean, it was just absolutely horrific, the descriptions of these women and their children. But this also led to certain types of civil punishments, too. The state of Wisconsin creating the euphemistic crack mama law, which provides for the forced civil incarceration of any woman for the purpose of protecting her fetus. So we have women like Alicia Beltran, right? You could say that Black women were the canaries in the coal mine because now this is all cut up to white women. Alicia Beltran, just a few years ago, serving over 70 days in a Wisconsin facility. A lawyer appointed for her fetus, none for her, even though she requested one 3 times. Her crime, or what she was suffering behind bars for, was the fact that she had told a medical provider that earlier in her life she had suffered from addiction to prescription medications. She no longer was using any prescription medication. She had clean tests and everything. But the fact that this law was on the book, originally intended and used against Black women, could in the 2010s be used in this capacity against her. But the last thing that I'd like to flag before moving it on, because I think grounding these discourses is very important, is that much of this has been born out of racism, anti-immigration dogma. If we look back to the time of the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, abortion was legal. Midwives controlled nearly 100% of women's reproductive health care. There were direct campaigns at that time to both get rid of midwives and to use abortion, anti-abortion, as a platform to do it. And the American Medical Association was the vehicle that sponsored much of this. I'll continue when we go back to our broader discussion. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Michelle. Next up, we have Deborah Katz.
Thanks. This panel has it all. So this is going to be a
soup
rough,
to nuts.
Right. This is going to be a rough transition. We're now going to talk about sexual harassment.
But they're all related.
Of
Yes.
course. And they're all.
Your challenge, connect the dots.
Your challenge is to liberate us from all of it.
There you go.
Yes. So when the Me Too movement emerged in October of 2017 in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein revelations, it really showed an open secret. We all knew this, that sexual harassment is a scourge sexual assault, sexual violence. It's just endemic in our society, and it's endemic in our workplaces. And one of the things that was revealed in the wake of this, when it finally got attention, and in the wake of tweeting 19 million people, Me Too, taking Tarana Burke's two very powerful words, and tweeting Me Too, the world could no longer deny that this is serious and it's everywhere, and politics of denial would no longer work. So in this moment, which is a phenomenal moment of societal reckoning, we have to come to terms with the fact that our institutions are recalcitrant, they are not changing. We are in the most repressive time politically in my lifetime. We are primed as a society to say no more. We are done. We are disgusted. We are willing to take courageous steps to fight this, and yet we have the most repressive administration that will do everything it can in its power to roll back our rights at a time when we are all willing to just get in the streets and be brave. And we have to do that. There's no other way. What Me Too revealed is that we have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for now 55 years, and the law is ineffective. It does not protect workers from underlying harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. And in this moment, there are good people looking for policy prescriptions. How do we deal with this? And what we know is that for millions and millions of workers, sexual harassment is a common feature of everyday life, and people do not come forward because threats of retaliation are real, and people live paycheck to paycheck. So we know that hostile and abusive work environments are very much a feature of the 21st century workplace, and we have to acknowledge that the law has failed dramatically to prevent and remedy widespread harassment. We all know in this room that harassment, sexual harassment, any kind of harassment, it rests on entrenched imbalances and abuses of power, and that the only way to meaningfully change our workplace is to shift overall power structures. That has to change. And systemic change cannot come from individual action alone. And it is really crucial that in this moment we support labor reform and we take bold action together. We cannot let anybody behind in this Me Too era, and that means low-income workers, low-wage workers, really crucial. And we see really great work being done in this area, and I think we've all been really awed by the McDonald workers who've gone on strike. And I think it is really clear that that kind of action is what's really necessary. And it's part of a bigger action to demand a living wage and other worker protections. We can't just see sexual harassment as an issue by itself. It's just one form of discrimination. And it's a broader part of discrimination about wage inequities and just failure to have women be at appropriate levels within organizations. So I'm just going to talk very quickly, just tick off 5 things that just have to happen if we're serious about addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. First, we have to get rid of mandatory arbitration. It is a serious ill. 68 million workers do not have access to courts, and we know that when you do not have access to courts and you're relegated to going before mandatory arbitration, workers don't go, lawyers do not take those cases, the success rates are lower, even when workers prevail, the amounts that they're paid are abysmally less. Mandatory arbitration favors corporations. It's got to go. Secondly, Title VII, in defining sexual harassment, this actually isn't in the law, but sexual harassment is, to meet the requisite standard, you have to show that harassment is severe or pervasive. And this is a litmus test. Conservative judges think that grabbing a woman 5 times and sexually propositioning her 3 times and a whole host of other completely unacceptable behavior is not severe or pervasive. So we need better standards. The second thing we have to look at is in our current economy, sexual harassment does not cover a whole segment of our gig economy, and I'm getting a stop sign, so I will. Just last thing, 3 other things. Last 7 things. We have to increase the caps on damages. They were set in 1991, unrealistically low. We have to have personal liability for people who harass and violate the law. And we have to change the definition in Vance v. Ball State to have a standard for what a supervisor actually does in the workplace and make employers responsible legally for their actions. 5 more things.
Let's wait.
I'm
Let's
kidding.
wait.
That was
Leave them wanting more. Excellent. Dina Baxt.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. So for those who aren't familiar with A Better Balance, we are a national legal advocacy organization based in New York with offices in Nashville and in Denver. And we employ 3 main strategies: legislative advocacy, direct legal services, and strategic litigation to advance and promote full equality and to ensure that all women and all caregivers can care for themselves and their families without risking their economic security. And we're really proud over the last almost 15 years to have worked in almost every state in the country to advance paid sick time, paid family medical leave, and fairness for pregnant workers, which are a few of our key efforts. And while we are seeing truly devastating attacks on reproductive rights, we have been able to make progress on the state level with respect to enhancing family economic security. And, so these issues around work-family may think these are just frivolous benefits, things that, are family-friendly, if you will, but these are critical measures to promote gender equality. They are key measures to help keep women, especially low-income mothers, attached to the workforce and earning the fair and equal wages that they deserve. And we know that these policies, if we're talking gender equality, policies like paid leave are critical for men too, and they need to be supported as caregivers if we're serious about, gender equality. And they are fundamental reproductive justice issues. When we need to think about these issues in the context of the workplace, what kind of support are we giving to women so they can bear children and aren't forced to choose between maintaining a healthy pregnancy and a paycheck, for example. And we see this every day, really every day through our free legal clinic. And, I just find it totally horrific. Back in 2012, when we were really hearing over and over again from women who would call us and say, my doctor said I need light duty so I don't have a miscarriage. And the way that our web of civil rights laws worked, these women weren't disabled yet under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Pregnancy Discrimination Act didn't really offer clear protection for them. And so we couldn't offer them, here's what you can do, or here's how the law protects you. And, they needed immediate answers in order to not, have to face an impossible choice between their job and a paycheck. And women like our client, Besaida Cruz Cardona, who was denied light duty and with no paycheck wound up homeless with a baby on the way. We had another client, a community advocate named Armanda Legros, who actually told members of Congress in a congressional hearing that we had on this issue several years ago that when she was denied light duty and not accommodated, she was forced to put water in her toddler cereal bowl because she couldn't afford milk. And women like our client, Lindy Trischler, who was one of only 2 women on the Florence, Kentucky, pregnant, but also only 2 women on the Florence, Kentucky police force. And when Lindy was 5 months pregnant, her doctor told her to go on light duty. Her gun belt was causing abdominal pain. Her bulletproof vest was so tight she could barely breathe. And she was having heart palpitations. But the city wouldn't accommodate her pursuant to a discriminatory citywide policy that said we only accommodate workers who are injured on the job. What's the result? She lost her health insurance and her apartment in the middle of a very complicated pregnancy. Unfortunately, Lindy later, the child was not born alive, but that is an unfortunate reality. It's unrelated. But anyway, Lindy decided to stand up for her rights. She reached out to Better Balance. We challenged the policy. The DOJ became involved. And after a 2.5-year process, we got the city of Florence to change their discriminatory policy and forced. But Lindy didn't stop there. She's now, she became an advocate for an explicit state law in Kentucky that provides an explicit right to reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers. I bring this up because Lindy, after years of testifying and advocacy on this bill, this law went into effect in April 2019. But every woman in America in 2019, in every corner of the country, shouldn't be in the position of having to choose between their job and a healthy pregnancy. And so we are advocating for the Federal Pregnant Worker Fairness Act, which would provide these protections for women across the country. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a 2015 decision, Young versus UPS. So that was supposed to solve the problem. Many hoped it would. But A Better Balance just recently released a report from Mother's Day that surveyed over 200 cases post-Young versus UPS. And the results were shocking. Women, in over 2/3 of cases, courts denied pregnant women rights to accommodations in the workplace. And the fact patterns are egregious. So, I mean, this is the state of play for pregnant women, and we can and must do better for pregnant women to achieve true equality. So I have a lot more to say on these issues, but we strongly encourage for the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act to be on your radar. We need it now.
Thank you. All right, Carole?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. You know, I start my comments with a little bit of sort of personal background so you understand the lens in which I see a lot of these issues. I've been practicing law, gosh, if I tell you 30 years, then you're going to figure out my age, right? But so I'll say 20 years then. And being a person, as my husband says, who can't keep a job because I've done a lot of things. He calls me Carole Gump, because amazingly, I've just had these positions that have put me in just incredible, what the heck am I doing here, rooms. And what I've seen, and when I took the time after I left the city of New York, spending 12 years as deputy mayor, overseeing, big stuff, right? For one of the major cities in New York, overseeing the criminal justice system, selection of judges, also participating on the selection of federal judges, working with federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities. I saw that if there was a list of 10 things and 10 priorities, number 15 were the issues that we're talking about today, if we even got on that list. And then this wasn't my issue, this wasn't my thing. I was a pointy-headed bureaucrat lawyer doing pointy-headed bureaucrat things. But after a while, you realize that there's something systemically wrong. And I'm not saying it was a plot, it wasn't a conspiracy. It was the way it was, and it is the way it is. And I'm telling tales out of school, and I will tell you that in most of those times, I was either the only woman in the room, or maybe there was a second woman in the room, but we are not in the room when it happens. I hope Lin-Manuel Miranda doesn't sue me for plagiarism. So when I left city government and I started saying, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I saw the tsunami that was coming towards women's rights before Me Too, before Time's Up, before Donald Trump. And I started doing research, and I realized, and I kind of pulled the string of gender inequality, and I found we're not in the United States Constitution. And I started doing research on the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And I got a visit by the person who had kind of restarted the movement. I'll do a plug for her book, right? So she gives me this book, Equal Means Equal, and I'm like half asleep at the breakfast, and I'm like, why are you even talking about this? And now I'm going to embarrass myself. Didn't that thing pass? And she looked at me and she says, oh my God, shh, don't tell anybody. But what she also told me is they were about to release a poll that showed that over 80% of Americans thought that the ERA passed, and over 90% wanted it passed, right? So this is before any of this was cool or people were talking about it. And I said, well, why is this even a thing? So I read the book and I find out that a lot of what's happened is we've spent a lot of time as lawyers working on the litigation strategies. I love litigation. My husband's a judge, so if I didn't say that, he'd divorce me. But the fact of the matter is we don't have constitutional equality. So as I got involved and I met with Jessica, and I said, what can I do? How can I get involved? And she says, why don't you become the co-president of the ERA Coalition? And as I did that, I started traveling around the country and realizing that there had been a movement afoot for 20 years that nobody knew about. So I said, wow, this is like the best kept secret. And so there was two strategies. One is we call the Carolyn Maloney strategy, where she has legislation to start over. And then there was the 3-state strategy. Hey, we just need 3 more states. Pick up where the effort left off in the 80s. What happens? Nevada passes it after 20 years. How the heck did that happen? Then Illinois does it the very next year. I said, oh my God, this is getting good. So for the last 2 years, we have been seeing this incredible energy leading and being part of and riding off of the incredible energy from Me Too and Time's Up, and people realizing there is a constitutional thread that runs along all of this. And we were in a position to tell that story, having scholars like Jessica Neuwirth commission this incredible group of scholars to get together, because people say, oh, that thing is dead and it'll never happen. And so I have lots of research and legal memos here. If you want, I'll start reading them, you know, in Latin. Available for distribution and on the ERA Coalition website. But to say that the legal strategies are here. What we saw that it wasn't being discussed in Congress. Now there are bills in place to remove a deadline, which has been perceived as one of the impediments. So I'm just going to say 2 things. Not 3 and not 5, but 2, and they'll be really fast. So last year we went to Congress and we said, it has been 33 years, you haven't had a hearing. You know, you better have a hearing or there's going to be a problem. I wasn't sure what leverage we were going to have. And can you believe they had a shadow hearing? And it was like standing room only. And Gerald Nadler comes in and he sees all the people. He thought he was going to be the only person showing up, and it was like 15 Congress people. So he says at the hearing, I'm going to have a real hearing next year when I become the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And that was as a result of the lobbying that we had done that afternoon in his office. He had said the same thing. Well, you know, there's so many priorities and da-da-da. And so I just looked at him and I said, what is more important than women's civil rights? And he looked and he goes, okay, I think you're going to have your hearing. So that hearing took place 2 weeks ago. And it's as a result of people, I don't want to use the word lobbying because I'm not a lobbyist. I'm a pointy-headed bureaucrat lawyer who wants to talk about constitutional equality for women. And I want people to realize, A, it didn't pass, and B, there's an effort afoot. C, there are really, really smart constitutional scholars that are sitting in the back room with Jessica Neuwirth coming up with legal strategies. 2 things that was, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Thanks, Carole. Inez?
Hi, thanks to the American Constitution Society for having me to be the hopefully friendly opposition. I just wanted to demarcate myself with elephants, you know, just so everybody can point me out in the room. I have a radically different background than the rest of these ladies, not only in my philosophy, but also in the choice not to practice law after law school. So I will not be disputing the intricacies of harassment law with Deborah Katz, who is, I listened to you on a podcast the other day. I was like, oh gosh, she knows what she's talking about. So instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about the general status of women and perhaps offer a little bit of a different take on that and talk a little bit about the ERA. The prompt for this panel includes a reference to the pledge to remove, quote, all economic, social, cultural, and political obstacles to women's participation in public and private life. That's a lofty goal. So instead of comparing the status of women against an imaginary utopia that hasn't yet existed, I would like to look a little bit at the on-the-ground status of women in the United States in 2019. And I think that it turns out actually we're doing pretty darn well. So thanks to a booming economy, we've seen female unemployment rate drop to its lowest level since 1965. Women own 4 in 10 businesses and are poised to hit parity with male business owners thanks to a 58% growth rate over the last decade. Women earn 57% of the bachelor's degrees, along with the majority of doctoral degrees. And perhaps most importantly for this discussion, women hold enormous political power in our democracy because we make up the majority of voters in almost every single election. None of this success or power, of course, means that women no longer face any kind of unique barriers. And my fellow panelists have laid out some of their vision for some of those. But I think in missing the forest for the splinters, we run 2 big risks here. The first is unintended consequences of action that we might take. So by any measure, protection for women against pregnancy and pay discrimination and sexual harassment, even though there may still be serious problems, have advanced in the last 50 to 70 years. That's when a lot of these laws have passed. As has gender equality as a whole by most measures. So if this agenda was consonant with women's happiness, we would expect to see that reflected in long-term surveys. Instead, we see what's called the paradox of declining female happiness. That's not to say these policies have directly caused this decline, but only to suggest that there may be a mismatch between what the average woman cares about and wants out of her life and career and these issues. At the Independent Women's Forum, we pride ourselves in looking at policies that aren't just well-intended, but actually improve lives by enhancing women's freedom, choices, and opportunity. In trying to make men and women exactly the same, in many ways, I think we undercover what women actually want, what they actually say in surveys and so on, what they would like to see their lives, or the paths of their lives going. So what do the data tell us about that? Well, 70% of working moms said flexibility is their top reason for selecting a job. According to Pew, the plurality of mothers say their ideal would be to work part-time and not full-time. Only 17% of married women say they prefer to work full-time when their children are small. So this is not just a paid leave, a matter of 6 months or even a year. This is, throughout their children's young childhoods. These statistics suggest that sometimes when we're trying to fix disparities in the workplace or elsewhere, what we really might be doing is pushing back against the choices that women make for themselves. If our goal is not perfect sameness, but happy, prosperous, and flourishing women, then what can we do? If instead we were trying to maximize flexibility and opportunities for work-life balance that seem to make women both happy personally and happy in the workplace, according to surveys, we might come to a different set of solutions. So for example, we might see the burgeoning gig economy as not an enemy, but a friend to women who are seeking flexibility and the ability to set their own hours. While some kinds of protections are important in all kinds of work, moving towards classifying gig work like full-time employment might actually reduce the flexibility and opportunities that so many women say they want and need. To name just one small concrete change that we might perhaps be able to find some common ground on, currently private employers are forbidden from offering hourly wage workers the opportunity to choose to collect overtime and paid time off. Right, the option to choose between having additional pay for overtime work and then having, days time off in a bank account of days that can then be used for whatever reasons. This is common in government. It's both in the federal and the state level. There's no reason why private sector hourly employees shouldn't have that same flexibility, and I suspect it would appeal to female workers. So we should avoid imposing solutions that might imperil rather than advance women's ability to make different choices. And as I see it, unfortunately, the ERA's passage would do something like that. The footnote of Caroline products that birthed the entire, tiers of scrutiny, rational basis, intermediate scrutiny, so on, justifies that scheme. I got it. Now I have my two things. Justifies that scheme by pointing to the fact that discrete minorities, by definition, do not have majoritarian political power in a democracy. But as I just mentioned, women, in fact, do have majoritarian political power. So we also have the Lilly Ledbetter Act and Title VII and all these various acts that these ladies have referred to as evidence that women can flex political power through the normal political process should they choose to and agree. So I think that a lot of the issues that the ERA might impact, and we can get into those later, I think those issues are properly decided by an electorate and not by constitutionalizing the issue and putting it into the hands of interpretation of judges. So earlier I spoke of just two big risks. This is the last one. The second one, I worry that in emphasizing only the barriers to female advancement, we communicate something to girls in our society. The message is that the world is scary and will hold you back from pursuing your dreams because of your sex. I would argue there's little evidence that's true today, but it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy if we don't remind ourselves and those girls that women in the U.S. today have perhaps the greatest wealth of opportunities before them that any women in history have ever had.
Thank you, Inez. All right, so I appreciate that all of the panelists observed the parsimonious time limits so well. So we have lots of time for a robust conversation, and you've all given us lots to think about. So let me offer the first question. We've talked about a number of different issues. How, if at all, are these things linked? So question for the whole panel. Do you want to offer up some ideas about how we might understand all of these issues in context?
So I'd like to give a try, especially building off of what Inez has said, because I do think that it's important to go to ground what we state in empirics. And she has, right? So she has flagged that women actually do exercise power and authority, and I think it's important to ground what that looks like. The power and authority that white women might use might be very different than the power and authority, or the lack thereof, that black women, Latina women may have. And I think part of of this is our failure to really understand history as well. For example, if we just go back antebellum, we tend to root that and ground it as a white male enterprise. White men were controlling and doing all these horrible things, and then comes the Civil War. A failure to understand that white women were deeply invested in the subordination and the oppression of black people, owned slaves, and fought even after their husbands died to maintain that power, control, and authority. And so we fail to exercise a sort of deep and nuanced understanding of this and this kind of struggle that we've had over time, even if we think about something such as eugenics, the sort of horrible platform that we begin in the United States before Nazi Germany even has it. Nazi Germany adopts the model law that is legalized through the U.S. Supreme Court. Virginia has a law, it's a model law through Buck v. Bell, 1927. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the Supreme Court upholds a platform for eugenics to be in the United States. Those who were suffragettes at the time actually supported the eugenics platforms at the time. So actually what Inez flags is actually something important for us to understand, how women may also be engaged in platforms that are not necessarily inclusive or thoughtful about the empowerment of all women, and how these issues intersect at the very foundations of race and of class and of other kinds of statuses. And so we are not all made equal at all under the law or within political context. And access, proximities to power often guide what women may choose to do. A proximity to power, even without having it, for some may mean that it's more expedient to sell out other women than to actually think about the enterprise of actually forging ahead. And there's so much more to add, but I want to close to give an opportunity for my fellow panelists to think about this. Recently, I was asked, giving a talk at a forum somewhat like this, about what could I leave the audience with. And for a long time, I've been thinking about the hidden heroes of our Constitution. And often I think that those are, black women of the South, quite honestly, with their crooked church hats and their opaque stockings, because despite what might have been written by the founders who drafted the Constitution, when you think about those who made the sacrifices with hoses and dogs on them, all of that, so that there could be an equality in terms of a voting right, so that we could see an equality in terms of education, access to parks, access to pools, access to neighborhoods, access to where one could rent or own a home. Those are not things that were actually forged by lawmakers, white male lawmakers, either in Congress or those in courts. The people who actually made the physical sacrifices for it and continued day in and out to do that were a lot of black women in the South whom we give no credit to whatsoever, and history forgets what they have done. And so as I left a recent talk, I was thinking about what does it take for people who are bound and shackled in the United States, who've been put on a platform, and not just for a day, a week, a month, or a year, but decades that flow into centuries, being told, you're chattel, you're just like a cat, a dog, or mouse, and we can sell you. And what does it mean not only for the people who are sold, but for the people who are bidding over and over again, saying, yes, I see you as no different than a cat, a pig, or a dog. And I think there takes something incredible about what one sees in one's own humanity to stare that down and to say, I'm something more than that. And as being something more than that, I can envision a day where there is truly equality. And I want us to think about that kind of courage, tenacity, integrity that it takes for people to understand their worth. And I think that that's a lesson for all women, not just black women, Latino women, but I think that's a lesson actually for white women in these times.
I want to put some context to your very powerful comments. So when we talk about constitutionality and women of color, most people don't know that it is women of color who have been behind and in front of the resurgence of the Equal Rights Amendment. So we kind of coined the phrase and we called it the new ERA. and folks took it and they ran with it and they called it the new ERA, Women of Color Leading the Way. It was a black woman in Nevada who picked it up after 20 years and led to its ratification in her state. And it was like nobody talked about it or heard about it. They know about her now. They heard her testifying 3 weeks ago in Congress before Nadler. The women who are carrying these bills in North Carolina and in Virginia are both black women. And I want to hear that story. It's coming alive, but there is a new resurgence of a power base that has not hit, I guess, the mainstream media, but I think it's a really important point to bring out here, especially when we are talking about equality and the Constitution.
So what might actually link some of these things? So, Michelle, I think you sort of surfaced the theme of power and the idea that power is incredibly attractive even when it means you might be in the position to subordinate sisters. So if there is a thread of power that sort of links all of these things together, how do we begin the process of dismantling this so that we can have a more promising future for women, or in the words of Inez, an even more promising future since it's already so great?
Well, I need to jump on that. I'm sorry. I just do. First of all, you were brave to come here. Secondly, you cherry-pick statistics, and you didn't say anything about pay. You did not say word one about pay. And I would love to live in this world of unintended consequences where women and people of color and the LGBT community are treated with respect and equality. Because you know what? The world would look really different. And I don't fear those unintended consequences. I welcome them with open arms. There's nothing paradoxical in that. And these statistics about female happiness being disproportionately related to the government's efforts to give us more, you know, I'm sorry, that just doesn't comport with the experience that I see.
So to respond to a couple of these things, one, I didn't say that the decline in female happiness is actually directly related to these programs, but rather that there might be issues that are more important to the average woman than some of the issues that grab a lot of airtime.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting fact to note that, in fact, as generally men and women have become more equal in culture, we've seen female happiness go down. It's very hard with these large surveys to say, same thing with crime statistics, right? There's so many factors that could go into what makes crime go up and down that it's often very, very hard to winnow out a lot of these, statistically, a lot of potential factors. One thing where it's not that difficult, though, to start putting controlling factors on is, in fact, pay, right? So the Obama administration undertook a huge literature review in 2009 and found that the pay gap virtually disappears when you apply a number of controls. One is for example, selection of college major. Okay, the top 5 college majors are disproportionately, overwhelmingly dominated by men, 4 out of 5. There's one that's on rough parity. And if you flip that around, the 5 lowest paid college majors that lead to the lowest pay after college are disproportionately dominated by women. And in fact, even the pay there doesn't actually cover the whole benefits, right? Because it turns out that women prefer to work in fields like social work, like healthcare, where oftentimes pay is distributed at least in part through benefits, right? So those highly regulated sectors have high benefits. That doesn't show up in pay analysis. But this is not me talking. It's not cherry-picked statistics. It's a literature review conducted by the Obama administration. And so I think there's a lot of evidence out there to say that attributing a difference in statistical difference between the average woman and her wage and the average man and his wage doesn't take into account education, years in the workforce, hours worked, and a dozen other very important relevant factors if you're talking about, in fact, equal pay for equal work.
Your turn.
Yeah. So just a word on happy, the whole comment. So, you know, for the women that we represent, we never get to the question of happy, because what they need is to be able to put food on the table and to be able to, ensure that their kids get an adequate education and are safe and well cared for. And so that is what the interconnection here is really around economic status and how these issues really, really play out, and how invisible and unaware we really are about how these issues really play out so differently across the economic spectrum and harm low-income women. These are, sure, a lot of women, I've seen the surveys, we know it's true, professional women want more flexibility and want, and men too, the studies are clear. But the reality for low-wage workers who are one sick child away from losing their job, or a complicated pregnancy, or from homelessness, there are structural barriers that exist to prevent them from being able to achieve, economic equality. And so these are not just, individual problems for folks to just solve on their own. They are broader problems. And I have 3 daughters, and I was thinking about what you were saying. One is going off to college, and I think I just because I want her to acknowledge that the challenges that exist in the workplace doesn't mean that she doesn't believe that she can, achieve, and the world is open to her. So I don't think it is an either or, choice for women. I think it's a false way to think about it. And we have to, these are connected. Sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, equal pay, these are about power. These are about, who has influence, and race is a huge factor, too.
Absolutely. If I could add on there, I think power is at the center of so much of this. Historically, it has been. If you look at the Happersett case that denied women the right to vote even after the ratification of the 13th, 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court said, well, you can be a citizen, you just can't vote. Bradwell v. Illinois, when a woman went to law school, wanted to practice with her husband, the state of Illinois said women can't be licensed in this state. She brings her case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's the U.S. Supreme Court that places her in the position of your world is only the world of your home and children. She had she was determined that her life should be the life of law. It was the Supreme Court that said you need to be at home because of your delicacy, as if these were donuts we were talking about. The delicacy of who you are determines that you are fit for the home and not for reasoning. These are matters of power, and if we look at what constitutes our Congress and also our courts, we're woefully behind the countries that we would say are our peer nations, right? Thank goodness for the 2018 push for women into political office, but it still only scratches the surface. If we look at this data and we disaggregate, which is what we need to do to see how all groups of women fit within these patterns, then we'd see that there are still dramatic racial disparities. And even without even thinking about race, just look at what our Congress is. We've hovered around 20% of representation in Congress, and we could say that women have done it to themselves, right? Because you say that women do, women can vote, right? So maybe women have done that to themselves. And then you think about women in the judiciary as well. Again, woefully underrepresented. It wasn't until Jimmy Carter's administration that we really began to see women being appointed to the federal bench. And then what's interesting is to note that it's really been Democrats in office who then have placed women in the federal bench. Without that, and it's been a very slow trickling. And so access to power matters in the legislature and also in our courts.
So I'm the moderator. I'm supposed to ask questions, but there are a number of students in the room, and I want, because there are students in the room who are receiving this information, I think it's really important to maybe counter some of the things that you've said, Inez, because I think some of what you have said
instead of 4 to 1, it's going to be 5 to 1. It's all right.
No, it could be 1 to 1. I just want to say, some of the things you said, I don't want it to be naturalized. Like the idea that women go into social work or that they choose professions that are allegedly more flexible are choices. They are choices at the surface, but all choices are made against a set of background defaults that we can either choose to acknowledge or we can ignore. My mother became a nurse because there were only 2 careers available to women raised in the 1960s being a teacher or a nurse. Other occupations were absolutely foreclosed. There may be women today who choose lots of different professions, perhaps because of flexibility, and that may be because it is a true choice or because they don't see other options because of the negligible support we offer families for raising children, for raising families. So I don't want to naturalize the idea that women are making these choices and they are making them in a vacuum. We are all making choices, and we're doing it against a backdrop that is in part state constructed, in part privately constructed, but a backdrop nonetheless.
But also, we have to acknowledge that we put a certain value to that work.
That's right.
And that's fundamentally the problem here. That's sexism. I mean,
Well,
right
sure.
there,
I mean, that's the whole point. And I think it's really important to understand the role of lawmakers in this, because there are those that would say, well, these are the choices that women make, but that's the whole point of talking about Bradwell v. Illinois and a slew of other cases if we wanted to do a kind of constitutional law, sort of session here where over and over again the Supreme Court has been involved with saying, no, women, you can't do this, right? That credit cards in your own name, you can own a bar, but you actually can't work in your bar after hours. Over and over again, it's
Unless your dad or your father
Unless your
owns it.
dad or your husband owns it, or your brother. Over and over again, these casting of women into certain roles and positions. And it's important that we understand that, unless, in fact, we naturalize and normalize it, as Melissa was saying. And so I think that that's really important for us to understand that the role of women, oftentimes in terms of where women are, is something that's been precast, right? And it's something that women have been fighting hard against. And I also think it's important, now that we're talking about law and lawyers, to think about where we are. And that is to say that there's been data that looks at where women are in the workforce, and we know that despite the fact that we have parity now with women coming into law school about the same rates as men, some cases a little bit more, we still see the partnership gap. 17% of partners, women, right? Despite the fact that we've had about 2 generations of women being at parity coming into law school. What is that about? In general counsel's offices, it's gotten a little bit better, but that's still very much like the partnership track, right? Where there is a lot of suppression that happens to be there. And even if you look at who stays in big firms versus who leaves, would you even have guessed that the rate of African American women hiring is at law firms, major law firms, is actually less than it was percentage-wise prior to the 2018 economic drop? Right? And then if we look at the attrition rates, who leaves law firms at the highest rates, right? It happens to be black women, followed by Asian women, followed by Latina women, then followed by white women. And again, we have to ask, well, why is this, right? And it's not just because women can't hack it, right? It's something about the environment that's very important for us to be able to unpack and to acknowledge.
All right.
Good.
Go
Going
ahead,
to
Vanessa.
get a minute to respond to some of these concerns. What we're talking about fundamentally is a distinction between social construction and nature, and how to separate out. I think nobody denies that in America's history, and in fact the history of the whole world, there have been structural disadvantages, especially with regard to career outside of the home for women. The question is, now that at least most of those barriers, not entirely, but at least most of the explicit barriers, the cases that you mentioned about the ability to get a license to practice law, right? Most of those explicit barriers have disappeared. The question is, how much of the remaining choice is due to women simply on aggregate, not every individual, making different choices than men. And I don't think there's anything wrong in it with that. And in fact, I think it's interesting that we are talking about a career gap or a pay gap from that perspective. I mean, we could, for example, be talking about a responsibility and time with family gap, and for men. And it is strange to me that people who advocate or present themselves as advocating for the needs of women, the desires of women in advancing themselves, is to take the frame of reference that unless women behave and make in aggregate the same choices and value the same things in career advancement as do men, that that is the result of discrimination or of something negative, when in fact, oftentimes women, I can speak for myself, I chose not to go into a big law career. I could have. I graduated from the University of Virginia, could have done that track. I didn't want a family life where I had to work 80, 90 hours a week, and more power to women who choose to do that. That's great that those opportunities are open to them, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that more women than men on aggregate choose a different work-life balance. And I don't know why the male standard is the automatic standard that we're talking about as though that's the only way or the best way to live your life.
So,
Am I the only one who's been in the workforce and you found out that the guy sitting next to you is making $40,000 a year more? No. And you can't say something because if you do, you'll be fired. Can I just say a show of hands?
I think that nearly every room, I think that nearly every woman in the room, that hand would go up. I mean, statistically, we know that's real.
And so I don't even know how you measure the people, because if you would ask me that question on a survey, I would lie because I would be afraid that that would get back. Now I'm old enough and I don't care, right?
Right.
So we're dealing with a situation where inequality is very real, and the point that we need to really focus on when we talk about where is the string that ties us all together is most women do not report. They don't say anything. And we learned that so powerfully through the Me Too movement. It was like the lights were turned on. The flood of women who said, yes, that happened to me and that happened to me. Most women do not file lawsuits. They cannot afford to go into federal court. These are the outliers that have that, and that really was the conclusion that I came from Equal Means Equal. When I read that, I was like, oh my God, that's right. All these wonderful laws that we've worked on, which we hold to our hearts. So what is it that we should be doing to create a culture of equality, where if I am getting paid $40,000 less, that there is a culture of equality that, oh my, that must be a mistake. We have to look at that right away. Instead of somebody sitting you down and reading you the Girl Riot Act saying, if you say something, and this is the person who I would call and tell, right? Because you would defend me.
That's right.
And what would you say to me when now you would say, we're going to sue the bastards, right? So.
But, I want
Yes, I would say that too.
circle to a point that Inez made. I think that there are a lot of, I think there are significant false dichotomies in there. But there is something to be said about a culture, right? And so you flag, why is it, we're thinking about this through a particular lens, right? This sort of male lens. I don't think that that's necessarily what's happening, but I do think that we could think about a culture that has for a very long time embraced white supremacy. A culture that for a very long time has embraced inhumanity. There's a poster that I keep in my office from, I lived in Kentucky for a number of years working on school desegregation issues in the 1990s. And this poster is from a plantation down the road from my house in Woodford County. And in this poster, it advertises that there's lots of food, drink, it's going to be a great celebration, a wonderful party where there are a number of things being sold. It's oxen being sold, horses being sold, some slaves being sold. And it goes on and on. And I ask, folks who come to my office sometimes, what do you see in this poster? And they're like, oh, it's bad, it's slavery. I say, okay, and what else? Read it. And they say, oh, yeah, no, it's bad, the oxen, the horses. I say, yeah. And what else? I say, what about the mulattoes being sold? The mulattoes being sold. People who will sell their own children. We have to think about a culture that saw no problem with putting its own children up for sale. So the foundation that you talk about, I agree. It's a warped foundation. And until we can come to grips with the foundation of a culture that was that debased, one that we might love, that's been great about a number of things, but so debased that it was normal to celebrate the selling of your children with just a caveat to keep the mulatto wenches together because you don't want your daughters being separated when they're sold off to Mississippi or Louisiana. And that's not just one plantation. We're talking about an enterprise that lasted centuries. And it's important that we understand that. But I want to get back to this point about happiness that's also been raised, because I think it's important to add to this when we think about reproduction and think about the economy, et cetera, that the studies that show, the studies that track happiness and reproduction are absolutely fascinating, because what they show is that male happiness will increase by the number of offspring. For women, it plateaus after 1.
Preach. He's a joy. I want to come back to something. Truly is a joy. He's a joy. I want to ask a couple of questions to the audience, since you are intent on taking this on your own frolics, which is totally fine. You guys are going in great directions. You've said a lot of different things, a lot of different policy avenues that we might pursue. How should we prioritize these? Which are the most important things to focus on? Which are the most achievable things that we might look at? Are there coalitions that we might form across the aisle? And I think Inez has offered some places where we might actually work together. I'm reminded in Young versus UPS, that was actually a litigation brought both by pro-life feminists and pro-choice feminists. So is pregnancy discrimination a place where we can come across the aisle and sort of think about the importance of healthcare during pregnancy or worker protections during pregnancy? Are there other places? How should we prioritize this laundry list of things that we need to focus on?
Yeah, the promising developments with respect to pregnancy discriminations, we are seeing bipartisan support in the states for this, and we have seen unusual alliances around why pregnant workers should be accommodated, right? Whether it's economic security or whether it's health or health of the baby or health of, maternal health. And those are all there are various reasons why legislators have come to the table. And since 2013, we've seen a, huge number of states, including like South Carolina and Kentucky, I mentioned. So there is tremendous potential around pregnancy accommodations. That's not to say that every legislature, we don't have it in Alabama. We still don't have it in, some other very, red states. So there's still a lot. And
can I ask why is that? I mean, these are the states that you mentioned, Alabama. Right. Some of these states are the states with the most restrictive abortion laws, who seem to be very pro-natalist. Right. Why not do things that would help women become mothers?
Great question. I think,
the connection.
Right? I mean, we talk about these, we see these connections and the connections with maternal mortality too. I mean, March of Dimes has offered some really interesting statistics. Black Mamas Matter, all these groups have come together to really make these points about why we need these laws and policies. I don't know. I mean, these are not prioritized. I would add paid family and medical leave. These also has a tremendous opportunity to connect the dots, right? It's from pregnancy and then the baby, you have the baby and then who's going to care for the baby. And, we see, when we work to pass paid family and medical leave in New York, I mean, the stories of women and men, but disproportionately women who literally were not even healed from childbirth, but like days later were forced to go back, to work. I mean, this was not about, choice. They needed a paycheck to be able to, put food on the table and support their child. So, that is a reproductive justice issue. I mean, women should be able to, we all are going to need, whether a woman or man, I mean, women are having, bearing children. And as long as women are bearing children, I mean, they're going to need to heal. And both men and women need time to care. And so I think that, it's just, it is an issue that we should all get behind. We are seeing on our advocacy and our, organizing, and that we are bringing, a lot new groups to this. On paid family leave, Connecticut just passed a really, progressive paid leave law with a broad definition of families that really covers, LGBT workers in a way that other laws have not. So there's new alliances and new support for these policies that we are very encouraged by. And here in Congress, I mean, the politics, are such that I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but the narrative has shifted from, we don't need any form of paid family leave at all, to sort of how are we going to pay for this? What are the intricacies of the policy? So I am encouraged that at least the conversation is happening, and there are, bipartisan legislators who are thinking critically about how we can make paid family and medical leave a reality. So, those are two key policies, along with sick time. Yeah.
And I want to offer too. There are a number of these areas which I think that across every area that affects women's constitutional lives as full incorporated citizens, we actually shouldn't see tensions between the left and the right on these issues. The basic women's rights as human rights, right? These are foundational. But I do want to offer two, right? So the first is, I think, is important to think about criminalization, because that's actually a space where we have seen those who are Republicans and Democrats and all in between working for a better America, because the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. And for the most part, that's been framed as a male issue, which has been a big mistake, because the U.S. incarcerates more women than any other country in the world by number and by percentage. The U.S. incarcerates more women than Russia, Thailand, China, Mexico, and toss in another country combined. Most of those women happen to be women of color, but increasingly they're white women too, connected with opioid issues and drug issues, and also for women who are writing bad checks. Why are women writing bad checks? Because they're trying to take care of their families. Years ago when I was doing research on forced underage marriage, I was in the Philippines, and I was meeting with people who are working with kids who were sold into sex rings and whatnot. And one of the persons that I met was a person who had been a political dissident, and as part of punishment, her kids were tossed into jail with her. And I thought, wow, that is so cruel, right? Like, you really want to punish someone when you say, your kids go to jail with you. Well, in the U.S. now, we incarcerate so many women that for good behavior, your kids can be in jail with you. That tells you how warped it is. And so that's one of the spaces that we could work on. And I think it's really important to understand the connection between reproductive health rights and justice and the criminalization in those spaces, as states have continually, states have been doing this, but this also shows where power matters. We don't know about it if news won't report it. And if news don't think that it's important to sort of cover women's issues because of who's in power in news organizations, then these are things that we don't know about. But this has been a long building trajectory that we need to know about and that we need to pay attention to. Another issue that I think is critically important, and it is within the reproductive health rights and justice space, which is that in those states that you mentioned, right, these southern states, these red states have the highest rates of out-of-wedlock births, divorce, teen pregnancies. Also, these are the states where they have gutted sex education from the schools, so incredibly high rates of STDs that later transition into cancer, right? These should be issues that, given that these are happening in red states, that folks in red states politically should actually care about, and that we could join together in addressing, because it's not exclusively there, but it's significantly in those states where we see these dramatic harms happening. And they happen to be not suffered just by women and girls, but also by men and boys in those states as well.
So I'm not going to try to respond to everything just for the interest of time, but I did want to address what might be in common, where we might find some common ground on some of these issues. I mentioned before flexibility and granting more flexibility to workers. A lot of, now some of that is just work culture and we see that changing over time as more and more employers are okay with, working from home or with flexible hours. But I think that's something that also we have to deal with regulatorily. And so we might find some common ground in making sure that employers are able to offer flexible terms to employees. And I think, whether you think it's because of nature or nurture or social construction, the fact is that women do take more of the family responsibilities, and therefore flexibility is obviously, as we've all kind of agreed in survey after survey, something that's very important to women. So I think there might be some common ground there. In terms of paid leave, so I worry about some of the proposals for government paid leave simply because if you look at some of these countries that do offer broad and government-funded paid leave, you do see again, unintended consequences. Like, for example, in the United States, 43% of women or 43% of managers are women, right? We actually have a pretty high rate in comparison to most European countries. In Denmark, the Netherlands, and Finland, it's between 28 and 30%, and there are multiple studies published in those countries that link some of that to some of these generous social welfare programs, including paid leave. So there are unintended consequences, and there are here too. When in 1993, when the Family Medical Leave Act was passed, women ended up using that leave more often because, again, women bear the babies, and
they also make less than men, and since it's unpaid.
So, but they ended up taking more of those, utilizing the leave under that act more often than men. And so a Cornell study found that that law reduced women's promotion prospects by 8%. So there are trade-offs. This is not me. This is a Cornell study done by economists.
I'm not arguing with the Cornell study. But what you're not looking at is why this is the case. Why there is such systemic sexism in our workplaces that when women take leave, they're not perceived as valuable to the organization, as worthy of investment, as being able to be promoted. I mean, you're putting the cart before the horse and saying, well, because women suffer these consequences, women suffer these consequences because there's real discrimination in the workplace.
So are you arguing that there is no connection between time put in the workplace and who should be promoted? Because I think that that's extremely difficult economically. That doesn't make sense in a lot of industries. Now, in some salaried industries, it's not a matter of the number of hours you spend, and you can be equally productive, and some people can be equally productive in 6 hours as they can be in 10. But in other industries, that's not the case. That's the economic reality, is that the value you're providing as an employee is tied to the number of hours that you're at work.
See,
That's a reality of the world.
You're creating like false narratives here. I mean, the cases that I see are when the woman comes in to me and they say, when I've just had these children and, I have a new baby, and my boss says, you know what, now that you have these kids, you really shouldn't travel so much. You really shouldn't. And it's sort of a paternalism, but, maybe you shouldn't travel so much, and maybe we need to change your role a little bit. And then her male comparator comes in, and everybody's passing out cigars, and this guy is all of a sudden really a much more substantial person as he's seen by his employer because he's got kids, he's really diligent, he's working hard for his family. And these workers...
Stereotypes.
They're stereotypes. And these are workers who are contributing and working really hard. And yet there is a judgment put to a woman who has the child and bears the work responsibilities and probably much more of the family responsibilities, is they're not as valuable as a worker. And that's discrimination.
Go ahead.
We have 30 minutes left, and we have a really patient audience, many of whom seem very exercised. So we have a mic in the middle of the room, so if you have questions, please queue up at the mic, and we'll begin taking your questions. And while we're getting our first person to come forward, here comes somebody. Okay.
Just on the point of what women and men need, again, this issues around flexibility. We, have been working on this for many years and see how these issues play out across the economic spectrum. And with all due respect, I think you're completely ignoring the real challenges for low-wage women who really what they need is some predictability of scheduling and some sort of control over their work hours so they can actually be able to care for their children and not, make sure that they're leaving them on the street when they are called in to work and then they're said, oh, no, actually, you need to come back and work in 4 hours, and, they don't know what to do with their kids. I mean, it's just, and then they're not paid for the time that they actually show up. Who is caring for these children? And women do need to work, and men need to work, and so we have, we have to think about policies that promote some degree of predictability, so women and men, but women is can care for their families without risking their economic security. I mean, flexibility means so many different things, right? And for what is flexible, what you want in your career is so different for the realities of low-wage women, and we have to acknowledge that.
Okay, terrific. All right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Galina, and I'm from NARA Approaches, Virginia, so my question's a little biased, from a biased perspective. And my question's a little, so we almost made it over the mark with the ERA this year in Virginia. However, there's a real conflict between folks who want to pass the ERA and say we should not talk about reproductive rights in the context of the ERA because that's politically bad, and folks from the national perspective and a lot of organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights and NARA National who say, no, we absolutely should talk about the ERA in the context of reproductive rights because it will have a real impact on the right to have an abortion, the right to contraception, the right to bodily autonomy for women. And I wanted to know from the panel what you think about that and where you all land on the question of the ERA and reproductive rights.
But before we answer that, let's get a couple more questions so we can surface as many of these as possible. So I saw someone else, so let's maybe get 3 questions, and then I'm keeping track of all of them.
Hi, I'm a law student, so I appreciate, Melissa, you being aware of growing minds in the room. But I also really appreciate ACS bringing a diversity of opinions, and Inez, I appreciate you coming and challenging us and asking us to give reasons behind things and for us to think in different ways. Now I'm going to forget my question because it's so much precursor to it. So, Inez, I'm hearing you say that autonomy is important, that you want women to be able to make choices for themselves, and then you want those choices to be respected, and you don't want them to be just put against a lens of men. You want them to be like holistic of what women need. And I'm interested to hear how you consider the ERA to be limiting women's choices when my vision of the ERA is that it expands women's choices and makes them more able to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have the resources to do.
Okay, 3rd question?
Sure.
Hi, I'm a law student, and I was previously an engineer, so a male-dominated field, and I like to think that I am a normal woman. I live in Boise, Idaho, which is pretty much as boring as you can get. And I left engineering when I had my small children. I have a 1 and a 3-year-old, and I left because I didn't want to breastfeed or pump milk in a broom closet or the bathroom. I mean, who eats in a bathroom? So I guess my question would be like, what are we doing to look at these underlying issues of why there's not more women in these male-dominated fields? It just seems like such a no-brainer to me. Like, the girls are smart. We have this STEM education. We're raising these young, strong women, but then they have to breastfeed in a bathroom.
All right, so 3 questions. One, I think maybe Carole and Inez, you could duke this one out about the conflict between reproductive rights and
I told you that when we signed that.
No duking, okay, no duking, debating. Over the
don't do that
conflict
either.
between reproductive rights and at the national level and at the state level. A question about whether the ERA would actually be limiting to women directed at Inez. And then finally, a question about what we might do to begin to dismantle some of the systemic barriers that prevent women from going into some of these spaces where they are less represented.
Do you want to start on the ERA?
Well, in terms of the Virginia question, to get sort of into the real sort of nexus of those decisions, we visited Virginia a lot, and it's interesting that a lot of the, I'm going to use the word holdouts, or the people that, the legislators that, whose votes they were looking to get were Republican. And it's my sense that they felt that focusing on reproductive rights in the context of the ERA would not be an effective messaging strategy in terms of being able to identify, how am I going to persuade this person? That's number one. Number two, and just generally, about half the states in the United States, I don't know the exact number, have a state ERA. And there has been no litigation. There hasn't been anything that has come out of that has affected abortion. I think there's one 1999 case from New Mexico. And you're shaking your head, so maybe there's more. But as a general matter, that's what I think went into a lot of those strategic decisions at the grassroots level. And it would be sort of the grassroots Virginia activists that were working sort of hand in glove with the legislature. Because remember, it's a constitutional amendment, but it needs state ratification, and so now you're in the state house working with the state legislators. So it's a very, very nuanced and tough sort of political call. And my sense was that the folks that were at the sort of the Virginia state house level were organizing those strategies and those messaging and those outreaches to those legislators.
So there's absolutely a division, I think, among proponents of the ERA as to whether it would affect abortion law at all. There are a couple cases, as the New Mexico case, as you mentioned, and there's also a similar Connecticut case, both of which were decided on state-level ERAs that ruled that if the Medicaid program in that state covered the cost of birth, then it also, on the principle of equality, had to cover the cost for abortion. But even in the hearing a couple weeks ago, there were actually, disagreement among the pro-ERA panelists that had been brought by the chairman as to whether or not this would affect it. I mean, it's really up to judicial interpretation, and I think there are certainly compositions of the judiciary that would interpret the ERA as having consequences for the abortion regime in the United States. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, originally wanted, instead of going through Roe v. Wade and Casey, wanted, and grounding this in the right to privacy, wanted to ground it in an equality principle. So there have been those alternative arguments being made for quite some time, and some people do think that the ERA would enshrine that principle. Others think not, like that the courts are likely to stick with the grounds that they've already articulated for abortion rights. So that's, and then as far as the PR angle, obviously, it's easier for PR in red states where the majority of the population is pro-life not to attach this issue to the ERA. In terms of the autonomy issue and what the ERA will or won't do for women, part of the problem is that, again, we don't know how it will be interpreted. And it could be interpreted quite narrowly, especially with the composition of the Supreme Court, in a way consonant with, I think, that 90% of people who believe that women and men should have basic legal equality. Where it runs into trouble, in my view, is the possibility for it to be interpreted rather broadly and then to eat into some of the public policy debates that I think are fairly left to the electorate, which again is majority women. So some of those issues, like, the most famous issue that Phyllis Schlafly brought up is the draft. That's a little bit different today because we do admit women to combat positions, so that ground for upholding it in the past is gone. But forcing women to sign up for the draft is one issue. To what extent public facilities should be able to segregate men and women in certain instances, so for example in restrooms or locker rooms. And so there are several of other, and for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that Social Security spousal benefits, even though they were originally intended for wives, for housewives, now they changed the language. It's now gender neutral. They're just spousal benefits, but she didn't think that the changeover in language would fix the fundamental problem in equality, that these were fundamentally benefits for women who were choosing not to work. And so she thought there would be, the spousal benefits for Social Security would be a violation of an equality principle. So again, the range in how this could be interpreted from narrowly to very broad, that's what makes me worry that the ERA would short circuit some of the debates that I think, look, it's totally fine to disagree about whether or not women should be subject to the draft or whether spousal benefits should exist, or on and on and on. But I think those things are properly left to the political process, and that constitutionalizing them would put them beyond that process in a way that restricts the actual electoral power of women as well as men.
It's interesting as I hear a lot of these sort of unintended consequences type of scenarios. I never really learned about the 19th Amendment. So in the last 3 years, I've been sort of trying to learn about, constitutional amendments. And you hear a lot of these similar things came up around the women's right to vote and the opposition, and why women actually died in order to get the right to vote, right? They starved themselves and they did all these things to get attention. But many of these were very similar, awfulizing and what ifs, et cetera. So it would behoove us to maybe sort of learn our history and look at those and make the analogies. And so when we look at the awfulizing, we could say, "Oop, that didn't happen, and that didn't happen, and that didn't happen," et cetera. Anyway.
So what about the third question that the engineer from Boise, Idaho posed?
Go ahead. Okay. That's good. We practiced that. So let me just say quickly here that being a mom of a daughter who graduated from Stanford, both undergraduate and graduate, I completely understand where you're coming from, as my daughter majored in the STEM area. And, I think a lot of this responsibility in those spaces can start with our very universities, right? So many credit our universities with being these sort of liberal bastions. A university itself is to be open to thought. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been hard-fought and continual fights for there to be women who are hired in these spaces in tenure-track positions within the STEM area, even within law. I think if most people admitted to what happened in law school hiring and appointments committees, you'd say that there's some drag down things that take place to just get people of color hired, to get women hired. If that's taking place within law of all places, what's then happening in STEM? And I think that I think that we haven't yet unpacked what that looks like. When I think about Silicon Valley and the reports of discrimination, now that we all know about the sexism and whatnot, I had to think about institutions like Stanford and others. This is kind of like supplying, right, the folks who then are in those spaces. And we say, well, it's just those firms. But the people who comprise those firms are people who are educated at these places, who learned a certain type of culture about how you treat women, about, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And our institutions, though they've paid attention to Title IX, haven't necessarily paid attention to the cultures that they reify and replicate and produce to the rest of the world. And I think that there's a lot that we could learn from just starting in that space. And then if we drill down K through 12, I think that there is much on the rise in terms of expanding STEM, but more that we could do.
So I really appreciate, you raising that, because we don't have to just get women into these non-traditional jobs. We have to keep them there, right? And your example illustrates that you didn't necessarily choose to leave your job. You were sort of shoved out of the workplace because it was inhospitable and, you were unable to reconcile your need to pump breast milk, and the law does require a reasonable time and place to pump breast milk for most workers, but you obviously, that wasn't enforced, that wasn't the culture in your workplace. And so, making sure that workers, women, know their rights, that those laws are enforced, are really, really important, and accompanied by culture, right? Because it's law and culture, especially in industries, like, STEM fields. But let's also remember that non-traditional jobs are also like women in construction, right? Where those women, may not even be in a company that offers any benefits at all, and they, and their union may, if they're represented by one, may not get these issues at all, and, bargain for these benefits. And so it's really, really important that we start really thinking about making sure that women have, are protected from sexual harassment if they're in, let's say, these jobs that are male-dominated, that they're afforded pregnancy accommodations, they're granted paid leave, they have a reasonable, breastfeeding. These are not, crazy ideas. This is just, and businesses recognize that these policies are good for their bottom line. They help them keep workers. And so, I think that they, that those are important steps that we need to take.
Can I add a real micro point to those very good comments? The next time that happens to anybody in this room or somebody we do have power. You have power. So we don't have to wait till the next law that gets passed in your legislative session. You've got these badass women right on this panel, and I've done this many times. I've done it pro bono. I ran at one point the country's oldest civil rights organization, and what I learned, it was really crazy because you file a lawsuit, and what I learned was if I sent them a letter in a situation like yours, and let's say they tried everything, whatever, and I would send them a letter from Legal Momentum, and then I would say, oh, and here's a copy of the article that came out in the New York Times last week about the case that we brought against the city of New York, and we won. The next day, the problem would be resolved in 3/4 of the time. So they get a call from this lady. You're going to get your lactation room. You're going to get a call from Dina Bass. I mean, and I'm not saying this to be bold. I'm telling you that this is the truth. So we have to create, the ERA is not going to pass tomorrow. We're not going to get all the pregnancy discrimination legislation that we want, but we do have the power. We have it formally. We can, draw up the legal papers. And oftentimes, we have that interim step that we can do to let people know, you know what, this is wrong, and this is how we're respectfully asking you to fix it. And if we have to use our outside voices, then so be it.
Deborah, did you want to have the last word?
Sure, always. I just want to make one comment about this fear of unintended consequences. When we object to sexual harassment in the workplace, we have people like Mike Pence who say he will not take meetings with women alone in the room. That is not an unintended consequence.
Who wants to meet with Mike Pence anyway?
No, that's a very good point. Amen to that. We passed better laws on Congress to protect people on the Hill from sexual harassment, and now members of Congress are not hiring women or they're not taking them on business trips. And somehow, this is the unintended consequence of us demanding equal treatment. We need to stop using the word unintended consequence, because it's not an unintended consequence, it's an intended consequence. This is exactly what they want. We have to be brave, we've got to call it out, and we must not back down, because we have a vision of what this world should look like for all of us, and we need to take our space, and we need to be bold. And that's what this time calls for.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies. I'm going to reclaim my time here. Thank you for those of us who are listening on the live stream and who will listen to this on the video. This has been a really lively panel. I thank you all for your contributions.
Thanks.